Grania Everwood had been standing in front of the cracked mirror in her rented room for 20 minutes, and the word still caught in her throat like a fish bone. No. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, and she watched her reflection flinch as though she had struck herself. The green-skinned woman in the glass looked back with wide amber eyes, tusks pressing against her lower lip in an expression that might have been determination on someone else but looked merely frightened on her. She tried again, forcing her shoulders back, willing some steel into her spine. No. No. I said no. Each repetition sounded hollow, unconvincing even to her own ears, but she kept at it because the alternative was to go through another day like all the ones before, nodding and agreeing and saying yes when every fiber of her being wanted to refuse. The practice had started 3 weeks ago after she had agreed to work a double shift at the laundry, despite having been awake for 16 hours already, her hands raw from lye soap and her back screaming from hauling wet linens. She had watched herself agree in the polished copper pot that hung near the washing tubs, seen her own mouth form the words of acceptance while her eyes went dull with resignation, and something in her had finally cracked. Not broken, precisely, but developed a hairline fracture through which a tiny sliver of rage had begun to seep. That night, she had come back to this room with its slanting floor and drafty window, positioned herself in front of the only mirror she owned, and tried to say the simplest word of refusal in the human language. It had taken her 4 attempts before any sound came out at all. Now, weeks later, she could at least voice it, though the word still felt foreign in her mouth, sharp-edged and dangerous. In the orc settlement where she had been born, refusal had been a luxury afforded only to warriors and elders, and Grania had been neither. She had been a slight, small-tusked girl with a talent for needlework, and a temperament too gentle for the rough hierarchy of her clan. When the human traders had come through, and her father had arranged for her to go south with them to work off a debt, she had nodded and packed her things and left without protest, because that was what she had been taught to do. The debt had belonged to her father, but the labor had fallen to her, and she had spent 5 years in the house of Mistress Urith, a wealthy merchant's widow who had a gift for identifying people who could not say no and extracting every ounce of work from them until they were hollowed out and grateful for the privilege. Grania had learned a great deal in that house. She had learned to embroider so finely that her stitches were nearly invisible, to press linens so they lay flat as water, to keep her eyes down and her voice soft, and to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud. She had learned that invisible people were safe people, that compliance was a form of armor, and that the word no was a spark that could burn down everything you had managed to build. She had also learned that 5 years could feel like 50 when you never once refused a single request, no matter how unreasonable, no matter how it ground you down into something less than yourself. The debt had been paid off 6 months ago. Mistress Urith had informed her of this with the same tone one might use to comment on the weather, and Grania had understood that she was free to leave. She had also understood, in the way of someone who has been shaped by years of careful conditioning, that she could stay if she wished, that there would always be a place for someone so useful, so obliging, so utterly unable to make trouble. She had left that very night with 2 dresses, a spare pair of boots, and the awful certainty that she would simply find another Mistress Urith somewhere else. Another situation where her inability to refuse would be expertly exploited, unless she learned to speak that simple, terrible word. The mirror practice had become a ritual. Every morning before she went to the laundry where she now worked, and every evening when she returned. No, I cannot do that. No, I am not available. No, that does not work for me. She tried different phrasings, different tones, watching her face for any sign that she believed herself. Mostly she just looked afraid, but occasionally, in certain lights, she thought she saw something harder in her expression, some quality that might one day grow into actual refusal. The problem was that she had yet to say it to another living soul. The marketplace in Millbrook was crowded on sixth-day mornings, and Grania wove through the press of bodies with the careful invisibility she had perfected over years of practice. She had come to buy thread for a mending job she had taken on the side, small piecework that helped supplement the wages from the laundry, and she had calculated precisely how much she could afford to spend. The thread seller was a sharp-eyed man named Corvin, who had a tendency to talk people into buying more than they needed, and Grania had been steeling herself all morning for the transaction. 2 spools of the linen thread, she said quietly when she reached his stall, pointing to the one she needed. Her voice came out steady, which she counted as a minor victory. Corvin beamed at her with the particular smile of a man who sensed opportunity. 2 spools, certainly, certainly. But you know, I have a special lot that just came in, much finer quality, and if you were to buy 4 spools I could offer you a price that would make it foolish to refuse. You do a lot of mending, do you not? A girl like you, I am sure you could use the extra thread, and this price will not last past today. Grania felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She had budgeted for 2 spools. 4 would mean going without something else this week, probably food. The thread he was showing her was finer, that much was true, but she did not need finer thread for the work she had been hired to do. She needed to say no. She needed to say it right now, to this man in this moment, and prove to herself that the mirror practice had been worth something. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Corvin was still talking, wrapping the 4 spools in paper, his hands moving with the swift efficiency of someone who knew the sale was already done. You will thank me later, truly. This is an investment in your craft. That will be 9 crescents, a bargain at twice the price. 9 crescents. She had brought 6. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her tusks. She started, and hated the tremor in her voice. I only need, trust me on this, girl, Corvin said, not unkindly but with the absolute certainty of someone who had never doubted his own judgment. You will use all 4 before the month is out. She would not. She knew she would not. And yet her hand was moving toward her purse, her fingers counting out coins she could not afford to spend, and the word no was locked somewhere behind her teeth, impossible to access, like a door that had been nailed shut from the inside. That seems like a substantial amount of thread for someone who only asked for 2 spools. The voice came from behind her, warm and amused, and Grania startled so badly she nearly dropped her purse. She turned to find a man leaning against the side of Corvin's stall, arms crossed, watching the exchange with an expression of cheerful interest. He was tall, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that fell in unruly waves to his collar and the kind of face that seemed built for laughter, all curved lines and expressive features. His clothes marked him as someone who traveled, well-made but dusty from the road, and there was a pack at his feet stuffed with what looked like sample goods. A peddler, then, or perhaps a merchant of some kind, and Grania felt her stomach sink because the last thing she needed was another person trying to sell her something. But he was not looking at her with the assessing gaze of someone sizing up a mark. He was looking at Corvin, and his smile had gained a sharp edge that did not quite match the easy warmth of his voice. The young lady asked for 2 spools, he continued, pushing away from the stall and moving to stand beside Grania with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to insert himself into a situation. and you are attempting to sell her for at a price that would be steep even for your finest stock, which that is not. I have been in this business long enough to recognize mid-grade linen thread when I see it, Corvin, and I am quite certain you know it too." Corvin's smile had frozen on his face, gone hard and commercial. "I am offering a fair deal to a customer who understands the value of quality goods. You are offering an inflated price to someone you have identified as too polite to refuse you." The peddler's voice was still pleasant, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath now, the tone of someone who had seen this particular trick many times and had no patience for it. "2 spools of linen thread at the standard market rate is 4 crescents. Shall we settle on that? Or shall I direct the lady to Mara's stall 2 rows over, where I happen to know the thread is actually better and the prices are honest?" For a long moment Corvin stared at the peddler with the expression of a man recalculating the odds, and then his face shifted back into professional courtesy, the kind that was all surface and no warmth. "4 crescents for 2 spools, as the gentleman suggests." Grania counted out the coins in a daze, accepted the package, and turned away from the stall with her face burning and her thoughts in chaos. The peddler fell into step beside her, as though they had planned to walk together, guiding them both away from the main press of the market and into one of the quieter side lanes, where the noise dropped to a more manageable level. "You did not have to do that," Grania managed finally, because it seemed like something needed to be said, and that was the first sentence her brain supplied. She still felt shaky, caught between relief and humiliation, grateful for the intervention and furious with herself for needing it. "I know I did not have to." The peddler grinned at her, entirely unrepentant, and up close she could see that his eyes were a clear gray-blue, the color of the sky just before a storm. "But Corvin has been running that same routine on every new face in this market for as long as I have been coming through Millbrook, and I have always found it insufferably tedious. Besides, you looked like you were about 10 seconds away from agreeing to buy his entire inventory just to escape the conversation, and I have a personal policy against standing by while people are pressured into bad decisions." "I was handling it," Grania said, which was a blatant lie and they both knew it, but she felt compelled to offer some defense of her own competence. "Of course you were." His tone was absolutely sincere, with no trace of mockery, and somehow that made it worse. "You were handling it in the way that would have cost you 3 extra crescents and left you with thread you did not need, which is a kind of handling, I suppose, though not the kind I would recommend." They had reached a small courtyard where a few benches sat in the shade of an old oak tree, and the peddler dropped onto one of them with the ease of someone who had spent most of his life on his feet and took rest wherever he could find it. He gestured to the space beside him in a way that was invitation rather than command, and after a moment's hesitation, Grania sat, perching on the edge of the bench with her package of thread clutched in both hands. "I am Fennec Zalter," he said, extending a hand. "I buy and sell curiosities, small goods, the kind of things people do not know they want until they see them. I have been on the road for about 5 years now, and I am in the process of deciding whether to settle down somewhere and open an actual shop, which is either a brilliant idea or a terrible one depending on which day you ask me." Grania shook his hand carefully, very aware of her own strength and the way humans sometimes flinched from the sight of her claws. Fennec did not flinch, just clasped her hand firmly and released it without any of the usual hesitation. "Grania Everwood. I work at the laundry on the south side of town, and I do mending when I have time. I am not," she stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. "Not what? Not good at markets, not capable of refusing people, Not someone who needed rescuing, even though she clearly did. Not used to people like Corvin, Fennec finished for her, and his voice had gentled. That is nothing to be ashamed of. He is very good at what he does, which is to say he is very good at identifying the exact moment when someone is too uncomfortable to argue, and then pressing that advantage for all it is worth. Some people have a talent for refusal, and some of us have to learn it the hard way. And which are you? Grania asked before she could stop herself. Fennec laughed, a sound of genuine delight that seemed too big for the quiet courtyard. Oh, I am absolutely the first kind, which is probably why I am so annoying about intervening when I see the second kind getting backed into corners. My mother used to say I was born arguing, and I have never found much evidence to contradict her. But I have known plenty of people who had to learn it, and they are not lesser for the learning. Sometimes the most important skills are the ones that do not come naturally. He said it so matter-of-factly, with no pity or condescension, and something in Grania's chest loosened slightly. She found herself explaining, in halting sentences, about the mirror practice, about the weeks of trying to shape her mouth around that single syllable, about the frustration of knowing what she needed to do and being utterly unable to do it when the moment arrived. She had not planned to tell him any of it, certainly had not intended to confess her failures to a stranger in a market courtyard. But Fennec listened with the kind of attention that made speaking feel safe, and the words spilled out before she could think better of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he said, "May I make a suggestion? And you are absolutely free to tell me no if it is a terrible idea. I will not be offended in the slightest." "All right," Grania said cautiously. "Mirrors are useful for practice, but they are not people. They do not push back, they do not apply pressure, they do not have expectations. You can say no to a mirror 1,000 times, and it will never prepare you for the moment when you have to say it to someone like Corvin, because the mirror does not make you afraid of consequences." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and met her eyes with that steady gray-blue gaze. "So here is my suggestion. I am going to be in Millbrook for at least another month, possibly longer if I decide to lease that shop space I have been looking at. During that time, you should practice saying no to me." Grania blinked. "What?" "Practice saying no to me," Fennec repeated, as though this were the most reasonable proposal in the world. "I will ask you questions, make requests, suggest things, and your job is to refuse me whenever you genuinely want to refuse. No consequences, no pressure, no cost. Just you, learning what it feels like to say the word to another person who will hear it and accept it without making you pay for it. That is," Grania stopped, trying to wrap her mind around the idea. "That is a very strange offer." "I am occasionally a very strange man," Fennec agreed cheerfully. "But I think it would help, and I am volunteering, which means you would not owe me anything. Think of me as a sort of practice dummy, except I talk back and have moderately better fashion sense than your average training equipment." "Why would you do that?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with the suspicion that came from years of learning that nothing was ever offered without expectation of return. Fennec considered this seriously, his gaze drifting to the oak tree's canopy where leaves filtered the morning light into shifting patterns. "Partly because I think you deserve to learn how to advocate for yourself without it being a crisis every time. Partly because I find Corvin personally irritating, and I would like to live in a world where he has fewer, easy marks. And partly, if I am being entirely honest, because you have very kind eyes and I am weak for people who are kind in a world that gives them no particular reason to be. Does that answer suffice, or would you like me to produce references and a written statement of intent?" Despite everything, Grania felt a smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "I think that answers it." "Excellent. So here is your first opportunity." Fennec straightened up and turned to face her fully, and there was mischief in his expression now, playful and bright. "I am absolutely parched, and there is a tea shop just around the corner that makes a passable mint brew. Would you like to join me for a cup? And before you answer, please know that I am asking because I would enjoy the company, but I will not be hurt or offended if you would rather go home. This is a genuine question with no wrong answer." Grania opened her mouth, and the automatic yes was already forming, the habitual agreement that came before thought. But then she stopped, really stopped, and asked herself what she actually wanted. Did she want to go have tea with this strange, cheerful peddler who had rescued her from a bad bargain and then offered to help her learn to refuse people? She looked at him, at the open expression and the complete lack of pressure in his posture, and realized that she genuinely did not know. Part of her wanted to retreat to her room and process everything that had happened. Part of her was curious about him, drawn to the easy warmth of his manner, and the way he seemed to find her worthy of effort. "I think," she said slowly, working through it out loud, "I think I would rather not today. I have mending work I need to finish, and I am feeling somewhat overwhelmed." She braced herself for disappointment, for the subtle shift in expression that would tell her she had made a mistake, for the consequences that always followed refusal. But Fennec just smiled, and it was the same warm smile he had worn before, utterly unchanged by her answer. "Perfectly reasonable," he said, rising to his feet and picking up his pack. "The work does not do itself, as my mother was fond of reminding me approximately every day of my childhood. It was genuinely pleasant to meet you, Grania Everwood, and I hope our paths cross again." He sketched a small bow, more playful than formal, and then he was walking away across the courtyard, whistling some tune she did not recognize. Grania sat on the bench for a long time after he left, holding her package of thread and turning over the strangeness of the last half-hour in her mind. She had said no to him. She had said it clearly, without extensive justification, without apologizing herself into the ground, and he had smiled. He had smiled like she had given him something valuable instead of refusing him, and she did not quite know what to do with that information. She saw Fennec 3 more times over the next week, always in passing, always in situations where he could have stopped to talk and chose instead to simply wave or nod in a way that respected her space. It was such a small thing, that courtesy, but it settled something in her, made her feel less like she was being hunted and more like she had been offered an option that would wait until she was ready to take it. On the 8th day, she found him at a corner stall, examining a collection of small brass instruments whose purpose she could not begin to guess, and she walked up to him before she could talk herself out of it. "If the tea offer is still available," she said, "I would accept it now." Fennec looked up, and his whole face lit with pleasure. "It is absolutely still available, and I have since discovered that they also make an excellent honey cake that I have been waiting for an excuse to try. Come, let me introduce you to the second best tea shop in Millbrook, which is still considerably better than most." The tea shop was small and somewhat shabby, tucked into a narrow building that leaned slightly to one side, but it was clean, and the proprietor greeted Fennec with the kind of warmth reserved for regular customers. They settled at a table near the window, and Fennec ordered tea and honey cake, with the easy authority of someone who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. When the tea arrived, dark and fragrant with mint, Grania wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth seep into her palms while she tried to figure out how to begin. "So," Fennec said, saving her the trouble, "how goes the war against involuntary agreement?" Grania huffed a small laugh despite herself. I told my supervisor at the laundry that I could not take a double shift yesterday because I had other commitments, which was true. I did have mending work, but normally I would have just agreed and figured out how to do both somehow. And how did the supervisor react? She said that was fine and asked someone else. Revolutionary, Fenix said with deep solemnity, though his eyes were dancing. Next, you will be expecting people to respect your time and energy as though you were a whole person with needs and limitations. Shocking behavior, Grania agreed, and found herself smiling into her tea. I assume I will be run out of town for such audacity. They talked for an hour. Easy conversation that ranged from the absurdity of Fenix, least successful sales, attempts to Grania's ongoing struggle to master a particular type of embroidery stitch that required more patience than she naturally possessed. Fenix had a way of asking questions that invited real answers, and he listened to those answers with a focus that made her feel heard in a way she could not remember experiencing before. He also made her laugh, which was a rarer gift than he probably knew. Sharp little observations about the world delivered with perfect timing, and a complete lack of meanness. When they finally left the tea shop, the afternoon sun slanting long across the street, Fenix turned to her with an expression of exaggerated hopefulness. I do not suppose you would be interested in helping me look at potential shop spaces. I have narrowed it down to 2 options, and I cannot decide between them. And I suspect I need a second opinion from someone with actual common sense. Grania felt the old impulse to agree rise up, strong and automatic, but this time she had enough space to examine it. Did she want to spend her afternoon looking at empty shops with Fenix? She had mending work waiting, true, but she also found she was enjoying his company, and the idea of seeing him make a decision about his own future was oddly appealing. The difference was that this time she was asking herself the question instead of just reacting to the request. Yes, she said, and felt the word land differently than it usually did, chosen instead of compulsory. I can spare a few hours. Excellent. Fair warning, one of them has a truly baffling layout, and the other has a family of mice living in the back room. So we are starting from a position of limited options. The first shop was indeed laid out in a way that defied logical explanation, with the door opening directly into a narrow hallway that led to a main room that was somehow smaller than the hallway suggested, and a storage area that could only be accessed by going outside and around to a separate entrance. Fenix stood in the center of the main room with his hands on his hips and his head tilted in an expression of profound confusion. I think this space was designed by someone who had never actually been inside a building before, he said finally. They had perhaps heard buildings described by a third party and worked from those notes. Grania walked the perimeter, examining the walls and the single window that looked out onto an alley. You could knock through this wall here, make the storage accessible from inside. It would cost, but it would make the space usable. You sound like you have done this before. Mistress Urith remodeled half her house the 3rd year I worked for her. I was not involved in the planning, but I observed enough to understand the basics. Fenix was quiet for a moment, and when Grania glanced at him, his expression had shifted into something more thoughtful, less playful. You do not talk about that time very much. Your years with Mistress Urith. There is not much to say that would be pleasant to hear. That is not the same as there being nothing to say. Grania ran her hand along the wall, feeling the cool plaster under her palm, buying herself time to decide whether she wanted to open this particular door. In the end, she found herself speaking, the words coming slowly but steadily, about what it had been like to live in that house, To be ground down day after day by someone who understood exactly how to exploit compliance. To lose herself so thoroughly that she had stopped being able to recognize her own desires. Fennec listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he did not offer platitudes or try to minimize what she had described. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said quietly. "It explains a great deal, and it makes your mirror practice seem not strange at all but rather remarkably brave." "I do not feel brave. Most brave people do not, in my experience. They just feel like they are doing what needs to be done and hoping it will be enough." They looked at the second shop after that, which was larger and better laid out but did indeed have mice, evidenced by the droppings in the back corner and the faint scrabbling sounds coming from behind the walls. Fennec stood in the doorway and sighed. "Mice can be dealt with," Grania offered. "A good mouse or cat and some basic repairs to block the entry points." "Are you trying to talk me into leasing a mouse-infested shop?" "I am trying to point out that mice are a solvable problem, whereas that first shop would require knocking down walls. But if you want my honest opinion, you should take neither of these and wait for something better to become available." Fennec turned to look at her, eyebrows raised. "That is not the answer I expected. You asked for my common sense, not my encouragement. Both of these spaces are compromised in ways that will cost you time and money to address, and you have been successful as a traveling peddler for 5 years, which means you are not desperate. Wait for a space that does not require you to fix someone else's mistakes before you can even begin." "That," Fennec said slowly, "is genuinely excellent advice, and I am annoyed that I needed to hear it because it means I was about to make a poor decision out of impatience." He grinned at her suddenly, bright and warm. "See, you are already better at this than you think. You just told me not to do something I clearly wanted to do, and you did it without apologizing or softening it into meaninglessness." Grania replayed the last minute in her head and realized he was right. She had stated her opinion clearly, offered reasoning, and not once had she tried to take the edge off her refusal by making it less definitive. The realization felt strange and promising in equal measure, like discovering a muscle she had not known she possessed. They fell into a pattern after that, an easy rhythm of shared time that happened without formal arrangement. Fennec would appear at the market when Grania was shopping, or she would stop by the corner where he set up his temporary stall to sell the curiosities from his pack. They shared meals at the tea shop, walked the perimeter of Millbrook in the long summer evenings, and talked about everything from the practical to the philosophical. And through it all, Fennec made requests, small ones, at first. Would she help him carry a heavy crate? Could she meet him an hour earlier than planned? Did she mind if he brought a friend along? Each time he asked with the same careful sincerity, making it clear that refusal was genuinely acceptable, and each time Grania had to stop and assess what she actually wanted before answering. Sometimes she said yes. Sometimes she said no. And every single time Fennec accepted her answer with equanimity, adjusting his plans without complaint, never once making her feel that her refusal had cost her his goodwill. It was the most exhausting and exhilarating thing she had ever done. "I need to learn to stop asking you things," Fennec said one evening as they sat on the wall at the edge of town, watching the sun set over the fields that rolled away to the west. "You are getting far too competent at refusing me, and my ego can only take so much battering." "You told me to refuse you," Grania pointed out. "I did, which proves I am occasionally too clever for my own good. Last week, you turned down 4 separate invitations, told me my plan for organizing the stall was inefficient, and refused to let me buy you dinner because you said I had spent too much on tea already. I am beginning to feel superfluous." But he was grinning as he said it, obvious pride in his voice, and Grania felt warmth bloom in her chest at the realization that he was genuinely pleased by her growing ability to deny him. It was such a foreign concept, the idea that someone might want her to refuse him, might celebrate her boundaries instead of punishing them, that she was still adjusting to it even after weeks of evidence. "I could say yes more often if you would prefer," she offered, half teasing. "Absolutely not. I want you to say yes only when you mean it, which makes the yes worth approximately 1,000 times more than the automatic agreement you used to offer everyone." Fennec turned to look at her, his expression serious despite the lightness of his tone. "Do you know what a gift it is to know that when you say yes to me, it is because you genuinely want to and not because you feel you have no choice? I am not interested in compliance, Grania. I am interested in you, in what you actually think and want and choose, and that only works if you have the freedom to choose otherwise." Grania felt her throat tighten with an emotion she could not quite name, something too big and complicated to fit into easy categories. "That is a strange thing to value. Perhaps. But I have seen what happens when people trap themselves into situations they never wanted because they could not figure out how to refuse, and I have no interest in being the person who benefits from someone else's inability to advocate for themselves. It is a poor foundation for anything worthwhile, and I like to think I am capable of better." The sun was nearly down now, the sky gone indigo at the edges and flame-colored near the horizon, and in that particular light, Fennec looked almost otherworldly, all sharp lines and soft shadows. Grania realized, with the kind of clarity that arrives without warning, that she had fallen in love with him. Not the dramatic, all-consuming love of ballads and stories, but something steadier and more real, built from accumulated moments of kindness, and the radical respect of being allowed to refuse without consequence. It was a dangerous feeling, made more dangerous by the fact that she had no idea whether he felt anything similar, and the old fear rose up in her chest, the certainty that wanting something too much was the surest way to lose it. "You have gone very quiet," Fennec observed. "Should I be concerned that I have said something monumentally stupid?" "No," Grania managed. "I am just thinking. Dangerous pastime. You are not helping." "I rarely do." But his voice was gentle, and he did not press for more, just sat beside her in comfortable silence while the last of the light drained from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Summer shifted toward autumn, and Fennec finally found a shop space that met his standards, a narrow building on a street that saw good foot traffic, with a large front window and a back room that was actually accessible from inside. He threw himself into the work of converting it with the same energy he brought to everything, and Grania found herself drawn into the project, helping him paint walls and build shelves and organize the eclectic collection of goods he had accumulated over his years on the road. They worked side by side in the long afternoons, and the shop slowly transformed from a dusty shell into something warm and inviting, full of strange and beautiful things that invited curiosity. The day before the shop was set to open, Fennec stood in the center of the main room and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in with an expression of mingled satisfaction and disbelief. "I cannot quite believe I actually did this," he said. 6 months ago I was sleeping in a different town every week, and now I have a building with my name on the door. It feels extremely grown up and vaguely terrifying." "You could still back out," Grania said, testing. "Take to the road again, leave all this responsibility behind." Fennec shot her a look of profound exasperation. "You are trying to get me to refuse something, are you not? Turn the tables on me. Is it working?" "Not even slightly." "I am absolutely not backing out. I have spent far too much time and money on this venture to abandon it now, And also I have discovered that I quite like the idea of staying in one place, particularly since that place happens to be where you are." The words hung in the air between them, casual in delivery but weighted with implication, and Grania felt her heart stumble over its next beat. Before she could figure out how to respond, Fennec had moved on, already talking about the opening, about the inventory, about whether he should try to do something formal or just open the doors and see who wandered in. The moment passed, or seemed to, but Grania carried it with her through the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit the picture she had been assembling. The shop opened on a clear autumn morning, and Millbrook turned out in surprising numbers to see what Fennec Zalter had been building all summer. Grania stayed near the back, out of the main flow of traffic, and watched him work the room with the easy charm that came to him as naturally as breathing. He had a gift for making people feel seen, for finding the exact item that would delight them, and by midday, he had sold half his inventory and taken special orders for twice that many pieces. It was a good opening, better than he had dared hope, and by the time he finally flipped the sign to closed and locked the door, he was grinning so hard his face must have hurt. "That," he announced, "was significantly less disastrous than I feared, and I am choosing to interpret it as a sign that I have made a wise decision." "Congratulations," Grania said, and meant it. "The shop suits you, does it? I keep expecting to wake up and discover this was all an elaborate dream and I am actually still sleeping in a ditch somewhere." He crossed to where she stood and took both her hands in his expression gone suddenly serious. "Thank you for helping me build this. I could not have done it without you, or at least not done it half so well, and I want you to know that I am aware of that." "It was my pleasure," Grania said, and realized it was true. She had enjoyed the work, enjoyed the sense of building something real and permanent, enjoyed the partnership of working beside someone who valued her opinion and trusted her judgment. "Would you?" Fennec started, then stopped, an unusual hesitance in his manner. "Would you consider working here? I am going to need help once the novelty wears off, and I have to manage actual daily operations, and I cannot think of anyone I would rather have as a partner in this venture." It was a good offer, generous even, and the old Grania would have agreed immediately, grateful for the opportunity and terrified of giving offense by refusing. But the new Grania, the one who had spent months learning to assess her own wants before answering, stopped to actually consider the question. Did she want to leave the laundry to work in Fennec's shop? The laundry was dull work, but it was steady, and she had built a small reputation there for reliability. The shop would be more interesting but also more uncertain, dependent on Fennec's success and her own ability to learn a completely new set of skills. And underneath all the practical considerations was the more complicated question of whether working with Fennec every day would make her feelings more bearable or less, whether proximity would ease the ache of loving him or simply make it worse. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. "It is a significant change, and I would like to give it proper consideration before I answer." "Of course," Fennec said immediately. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands regardless, no pressure." That night, Grania stood in front of her mirror and practiced saying "no one more time," but halfway through she stopped and studied her reflection with new eyes. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had started this practice months ago. Her shoulders were straighter, her jaw set with something that looked like determination instead of fear, and her eyes held a steadiness that had not been there before. She had learned to refuse. She had learned to advocate for herself, to recognize her own worth, to understand that her needs and desires were as valid as anyone else's. It had been hard-won knowledge, earned through hundreds of small moments of courage, but it was hers now, solid and real. The question was what she wanted to do with it. She went to find Fennec the next morning with her answer, but before she could reach the shop, she saw a figure standing outside it. A woman in expensive traveling clothes examining the front window with an expression of cool appraisal. Grania's steps slowed, then stopped entirely, because she recognized that posture, that particular angle of the head, the way the woman held herself as though the world existed for her evaluation. Mistress Urith. For a moment Grania thought about turning around, walking away, pretending she had not seen. But running would solve nothing, and besides, some part of her knew that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she left. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and continued walking forward. Mistress Urith turned as Grania approached, and her face arranged itself into an expression of pleased surprise that did not reach her eyes. "Grania, there you are. I had heard you were in Millbrook, and I confess I was hoping to find you. Mistress Urith." Grania kept her voice level neutral. "I did not know you had business in this area. I travel where opportunity takes me, as you well know. And it seems opportunity has brought me here at a most fortuitous time." She gestured to the shop behind her. "I have been making inquiries about this establishment. A new venture, I understand, and doing quite well for itself. I am always interested in supporting promising businesses, and I thought perhaps you might introduce me to the proprietor, given that I saw you leaving here yesterday evening." There was something in the way she said it, a subtle emphasis that made Grania's skin prickle with warning. "I am acquainted with the owner, yes. How fortunate. Then you can facilitate a conversation I would very much like to have." Mistress Urith smiled, and it was the smile of a hunting cat. "You see, I have been reviewing my accounts from the years you were in my employment, and I have discovered a discrepancy. It seems there was an error in the calculation of your father's debt, an oversight that resulted in your leaving my service before the full amount was repaid. I am sure it was an honest mistake on your part, but the fact remains that you owe me for another year of service, or the equivalent value in coin." The words landed like stones in Grania's stomach, heavy and cold. "The debt was paid. You told me yourself that it was settled." "I told you that I believed it to be settled based on the information I had at the time. Subsequent review has revealed the error. Surely you do not think I would make such a claim frivolously." Mistress Urith's tone was all reasonableness, the voice of someone simply correcting a misunderstanding, but her eyes were hard. "I have the documents with me if you would like to review them. The numbers are quite clear." Grania's mind was racing, trying to remember the exact circumstances of her leaving, the conversation where Mistress Urith had released her. Had there been documentation? Had she seen actual numbers, or had she simply accepted Urith's word that the debt was satisfied? She could not remember, and the uncertainty made her feel sick. "I do not have the money to pay you," she said, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "I have been working at the laundry, but I have saved very little. Then you will have to return to service to work off the remainder." Mistress Urith said it as though this were the most natural solution in the world. "I am currently establishing a new household in the Eastern Territories, and I could use someone with your skills. 1 year, Grania, and then you will be free of your obligation with no further question. 1 year. 1 year back in that house, back under that woman's control, back to being ground down day after day until she forgot again what it felt like to have a will of her own. Everything she had built, all the progress she had made, would be stripped away, and she would return to being the girl who could not say no to anyone about anything. The certainty of it pressed down on her like a physical weight, and she felt her carefully constructed courage beginning to crumble. That seems like an expensive conversation to have on a public street. Fennec's voice cut through the moment like a blade through cloth, and Grania turned to find him standing in the doorway of his shop, arms crossed, expression pleasant but eyes sharp. If you are discussing financial matters, perhaps you would care to step inside where we can all be more comfortable. Mistress Urith's gaze flicked to him, and then back to Grania, calculating. That is very generous, but this is a private matter between myself and my former employee. I am sure you understand. I understand that you are conducting business on my doorstep and making one of my friends visibly distressed, which gives me a certain interest in the proceedings. Fennec had not moved from the doorway, but there was steel in his voice now, the same edge Grania had heard when he confronted Corvin all those months ago. Inside or not at all, your choice. For a long moment, it seemed Mistress Urith might refuse, but then she inclined her head graciously and swept past Fennec into the shop. Grania followed on unsteady legs, and Fennec brought up the rear, closing the door behind them and flipping the sign to show that the shop was temporarily closed. Inside, Mistress Urith made a show of examining the goods on display, running one gloved finger along a shelf of carved wooden boxes. A charming establishment. You have done well for yourself in a short time. Thank you. Now, what is this about a debt? Fennec's tone was all business, and he had positioned himself so that he was between Urith and the door, not threateningly but deliberately. Mistress Urith explained the situation again, her voice smooth and reasonable, laying out numbers and dates with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times. She produced papers from her bag, documents covered in cramped handwriting that she claimed proved the debt had been miscalculated. Grania stared at them and could not make sense of the numbers, her mind too chaotic to focus on columns of figures, and the panic was rising in her chest like floodwater. May I see those? Fennec extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Mistress Urith passed him the papers. He examined them in silence for several long minutes, his expression growing steadily more skeptical. Finally, he looked up, and his face was cold in a way Grania had never seen before. These documents are forgeries, he said flatly. Fairly good ones, I will grant you, but forgeries nonetheless. The ink is wrong for the dates you claim. The handwriting changes midway through the second page, and the calculations themselves are deliberately obfuscated to hide the fact that they do not actually prove what you claim they prove. I spent 2 years working for a merchant company that dealt with import-export contracts, and I learned to spot fraudulent documentation as a matter of survival. This is fraudulent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mistress Urith's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air around her, a tightening of tension. That is a serious accusation. It is a serious crime to attempt extortion based on false documents, Fennec countered. Would you like me to take these to the magistrate and let them make the determination, or would you prefer to leave Millbrook now and spare us all the inconvenience? Grania found her voice, thin and shaking but present. Why would you do this? I worked for you for 5 years. I did everything you asked. Why would you come here now and try to claim I owe you more? Mistress Urith turned to her, and for the first time, her mask slipped enough to show the calculation beneath. Because you are valuable, Grania. You are skilled, obedient, and utterly incapable of refusing a direct order. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How useful? I let you go once, and I have regretted it ever since. None of my new girls have half your competence, and they all have too much pride to be properly managed. I saw an opportunity to reclaim what I had lost, and I took it. That is simply good business. The words should have devastated her. 6 months ago they would have, would have confirmed every fear that she was nothing more than a useful object to be exploited. But standing in Fennec's shop with his solid presence at her back and months of hard-won self-advocacy behind her, Grania found that what she felt was not devastation but rage. It started as a small spark in her chest and grew rapidly into an inferno, burning away the last remnants of the fear that had controlled her for so long. "No," she said, and her voice was steady, clear, utterly certain. "No, I will not go with you. No, I do not believe your documents are real. No, I am not the girl you remember, the one who could be talked into anything because she had forgotten how to refuse. I have spent months learning to say that word, practicing it until it does not scare me anymore, and I am saying it to you now. No. Leave Millbrook. Leave me alone. I owe you nothing." The silence that followed was profound. Mistress Urith stared at her as though she had grown a second head, genuine shock breaking through the careful control, and Fennec made a small sound that might have been a suppressed cheer. Then Urith's face hardened into something ugly, and she took a step forward. "You ungrateful little. That is quite enough." Fennec moved smoothly between them, and though he was not particularly large, there was something in his posture that suggested he would not be moved easily. "The lady has given you her answer, and you have worn out what little welcome you had here. I suggest you leave now, before I do take these documents to the magistrate and press charges for attempted fraud." For a moment it seemed Mistress Urith might push the confrontation further, but then something in her expression shut down, going cold and remote. She snatched the papers back from Fennec, stuffed them into her bag with sharp, angry movements, and turned toward the door. "You will regret this," she said, not looking back. "Both of you. You are making an enemy you cannot afford." "I will take my chances," Grania said, and was distantly amazed at how calm she sounded. Mistress Urith left without another word, the door swinging shut behind her with enough force to rattle the glass. In the sudden quiet that followed, Grania felt her legs go weak, and she grabbed for the nearest shelf to steady herself. Fennec was beside her in an instant, one hand on her elbow, supporting without crowding. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I said no." Grania's voice came out wondering, almost disbelieving. "I said no to her. I actually did it. You did more than that. You eviscerated her entire strategy in approximately 3 sentences and made it clear that she had no power over you. It was extraordinary." Fennec was grinning now, bright and fierce. "I am so proud of you I could burst." Grania started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that caught in her chest, and then she was crying, great heaving sobs that she could not control, months of fear and anger and effort pouring out of her all at once. Fennec pulled her into a hug, careful and firm, and let her cry into his shoulder without trying to quiet her or tell her it was all right. He just held her while the storm passed, one hand running soothing circles on her back, and gradually the tears slowed and then stopped. "Sorry," she mumbled into his shirt. "Do not apologize. You just faced down the person who trained you to be helpless and reclaimed your autonomy in the most definitive way possible. You are entitled to some tears." Grania pulled back enough to look at him and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something soft and fierce and entirely focused on her. "Thank you," she said, "for backing me up, for recognizing the forgery, for all of it, really. I did very little. You are the one who said no." Fennec reached up and carefully wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture achingly gentle. "Though I confess I am glad I was here to see it. I have been waiting for this moment since the day we met." "What moment?" "The moment when you stopped practicing refusal and started living it. When it became not something you had to work at but something you simply were." His hand was still on her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone, and his voice had gone soft. You are remarkable, Grania Everwood. I hope you know that. I am beginning to, she said, and it was true. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe that she might be worth something beyond her usefulness, that her value existed independent of anyone else's assessment. They stood like that for a long moment, close enough that Grania could count the shades of gray in Fennec's eyes, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. Then Fennec cleared his throat and stepped back, running a hand through his hair with an awkwardness that was entirely unlike him. "So," he said, too brightly, "about that job offer. Is this a terrible time to bring it up, or—" "Yes," Grania said before he could finish. "Yes, I will work in your shop, on one condition. Name it. I need you to pay me a fair wage, not the kind of arrangement where I owe you for the opportunity or work off some imagined debt. A real wage that reflects the value of my labor, with clear terms that we both agree to." Fennec's face broke into a grin. "Absolutely. I would not have it any other way. We will draw up a proper contract, you can review it and request any changes, and we will both sign it like the respectable business partners we are about to become. Anything else?" Grania took a breath, gathering her courage for one more refusal, one more assertion of her own needs. "I need you to stop being so careful with me." Fennec blinked. "I am sorry. You have been treating me like I might break for months now. Asking permission for everything, never pushing, always making sure I have a way out. And I appreciate it, truly. I needed it when we met. But I am not that person anymore, or at least I am trying not to be, and I need you to trust that I can tell you if something bothers me instead of assuming I cannot handle normal human interaction." "Ah," Fennec looked genuinely chagrined. "That is fair. I have been overcorrecting, have I not?" "Somewhat. I understand why, but it is starting to feel less like respect and more like being handled, and I would prefer to be treated as an equal." Duly noted. "I will endeavor to be less insufferably cautious." He paused, then added with a return of his usual mischief, "Does this mean I can stop asking permission before I tell you I am wildly in love with you? Or is that still the kind of thing that requires advance notice?" Grania's brain stuttered to a halt. "You what?" "In love with you," Fennec repeated, with the air of someone who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through regardless of consequences. "Have been for months, actually. But I was trying to be respectful of your journey toward self-advocacy and not complicate things by adding my own feelings to the mix. But if you are requesting that I treat you as an equal and stop being quite so careful, then I feel obligated to inform you that I have been harboring increasingly inconvenient romantic feelings and would very much like to know if there is any possibility you might return them." "You smiled," Grania said, because her mind had latched onto that detail and would not let go. "That first day when I said no to having tea with you, you smiled like I had given you something precious. You had. You had given me an honest answer, which is rarer and more valuable than most people realize. And you have been giving me honest answers ever since, and every time you do it makes me love you more." Fennec was watching her carefully now, the playfulness fading into genuine vulnerability. "But if this is not something you want, if I have misread the situation entirely, please tell me and we will never speak of it again. I can work with you professionally and keep my feelings to myself, I promise." Grania thought about the months they had spent together, the accumulated weight of kindness and respect and genuine care. She thought about the way he had smiled at her refusals, the way he had celebrated her growing confidence, the way he had stepped between her and Mistress Urith without hesitation. She thought about standing in front of her mirror and practicing the word no, and how the first person to hear it had been him, and how he had reacted with delight instead of anger. "I love you too," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "I have for a while now. I was afraid to say it because I thought I do not know what I thought, that it would give you power over me maybe, that wanting something too much was dangerous. And now I think that wanting something is only dangerous if you cannot also bear to lose it. And I think I have learned enough about my own worth to survive losing even something as precious as you, which paradoxically makes me brave enough to try to keep you." She stepped closer, reached up to cup his face with one hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against her palm. "So yes, I return your feelings, wildly and inconveniently, and with the full knowledge that I am choosing this freely." Fennec kissed her then, soft and careful and full of promise, and Grania kissed him back with all the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and had claimed it for herself. When they finally pulled apart, both of them slightly breathless, Fennec was grinning like a fool. "That," he said with deep satisfaction, "was worth months of careful restraint. Only months. I feel cheated. Years then. Decades. I have been waiting decades for this kiss. I was simply not aware of it until recently." They spent the rest of the day in the shop, ostensibly working but mostly talking, planning, stealing kisses when the impulse struck them. There was so much to figure out, so many details to arrange, but for the first time in her life, Grania felt like she was building something on her own terms, with someone who valued her partnership as much as her presence. It was a heady feeling, made sweeter by the knowledge that it had been hard-won. That evening, after they had closed up the shop and walked back through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Fennec turned to her with an expression of exaggerated solemnity. "I have a request," he said. "All right. Would you consider moving in with me? Not right away, not until you are ready, but eventually. I have a house that is far too large for one person, and I would very much like to share it with you." Grania considered it seriously, weighing the practical against the emotional, the benefits against the risks. She thought about waking up beside him, building a life together, sharing space and time and the mundane intimacy of everyday existence. She thought about whether she was ready for that level of commitment, whether she trusted herself to maintain her boundaries in such close proximity. "Not yet," she said finally. "I am not ready for that yet, but ask me again in 6 months and I might give you a different answer." Fennec's face lit up, not with disappointment at the refusal but with obvious delight at her honesty. "I can work with that timeline. 6 months it is." They parted at the corner where their paths diverged, and Grania walked home alone through the autumn evening, feeling lighter than she had in years. When she reached her room, she stood in front of her mirror one last time and looked at the woman reflected there. The same green skin, the same small tusks, the same pointed ears. But the expression was different, the eyes clearer, the set of the shoulders more confident. "No," she said to her reflection, and the word came out easy as breathing, certain as sunrise. "No, I will not accept less than I deserve. No, I will not be used. No, I am not available for your convenience." She smiled at herself, fierce and proud, and the woman in the mirror smiled back. The seasons turned, and Millbrook settled into the rhythm of autumn and then winter. The shop thrived, Fennec's charm and Grania's eye for detail proving to be an excellent combination. They worked side by side through long days, learning each other's rhythms, building something that was truly theirs in a way that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with choice. Grania discovered she had a talent for identifying what people needed before they knew they needed it, a skill that had been honed through years of anticipating demands, but could be repurposed for something more positive. She also discovered that learning to say no had not been the end of her journey but the beginning. Having established her right to refuse, She found she had to learn the more complicated skill of negotiation, of finding middle ground, of asserting her needs while also respecting Fenwick's. They argued sometimes, inevitable when two people with strong opinions tried to share space and decisions. But the arguments were clean ones, free of manipulation or power games. When they disagreed, they talked it through until they reached a solution they could both live with, and if one of them needed time alone, they said so without fear of punishment. It was, Grania thought, the healthiest relationship she had ever seen, let alone participated in, and she treasured it with the awareness of someone who knew exactly how rare it was. Winter gave way to spring, and on a morning when the air smelled of new growth and the trees were hazed with green buds, Fenwick appeared at the door of the shop with a cart and a grin. "I have a proposition," he announced. "Should I be concerned?" Grania asked, setting down the inventory list she had been working on. "Almost certainly. I have been thinking about that request I made about you moving in. It has only been 4 months. You said you would ask again in 6. I know, but hear me out. I do not want you to move in. Or rather, I do want that eventually, but I have a better idea." He gestured to the cart, which was full of building materials, lumber and nails and what looked like window frames. "I want to build you a workshop." Grania blinked. "I am sorry, a workshop. There is space behind my house, a good-sized plot that is currently sitting empty and unproductive. I want to build you a dedicated space for your needlework and mending, somewhere you can take on more complicated projects and not have to worry about working on your bed because you have no other surface. Your own space, separate from my house and separate from the shop, where you can build whatever business you want without being beholden to anyone." He said it all in a rush, enthusiasm making the words tumble over each other, and Grania felt her throat tighten with emotion. "That is Fenwick, that is too much. I cannot let you. I am not doing it for you, or at least not entirely," Fenwick interrupted. "I am doing it because I have watched you turn down 3 different commission requests in the last month, because you do not have adequate space to work on them, and it is killing me to see you limit yourself that way. This is an investment in your future, yes, but it is also selfishly motivated because I want to live in a world where you get to do work you love without being constrained by circumstance." He paused, then added more quietly, "But if you do not want it, if it feels too much like obligation or charity, say so and we will never speak of it again." Grania thought about the commissions she had turned down, beautiful complex pieces she had wanted to take on but could not because she had nowhere to work on them properly. She thought about the cramped corner of her rented room where she did her current mending, hunched over by candlelight because the window did not provide enough natural illumination. She thought about having a space of her own, built to her specifications, where she could spread out and experiment and take on the kind of work that would challenge her skills. She thought about the cost, both financial and emotional, of accepting such a gift. Whether it would make her beholden to Fenwick in a way that would undermine the independence she had fought so hard to establish. Whether she could accept it and still maintain her boundaries, still say no when she needed to, still be her own person. "I want it," she said finally. "But I want to contribute to the cost. Not all of it. I do not have enough saved for that, but I want to pay a fair share. And I want my name on any documentation, so it is clear that this is my space, not something I am borrowing or that can be taken away if circumstances change." Fenwick nodded, his grin widening. "Fair terms. We will work out the finances together, draft a proper agreement, make it all official and binding. Does this mean you are saying yes?" "I am saying yes to the workshop. The moving in part is still pending. I will take what I can get." They built the workshop together over the next 2 months, with help from a carpenter for the more complex structural work, but doing much of the finishing themselves. Grania had never built anything before, and she discovered a deep satisfaction in the physical labor, in shaping raw materials into something functional and beautiful. The workshop took shape slowly, a small building with large windows for light and good ventilation, and a layout designed specifically for the work she wanted to do. When it was finally finished, Fenwick hung a sign over the door that read Everwood Needlework in elegant lettering, and Grania stood looking at it for a long time, feeling something huge and fragile swell in her chest. "It is real," she said softly. "I have my own business, my own space. Something that belongs to me." "You have always belonged to yourself," Fenwick said, coming to stand beside her. "This is just the physical manifestation of that truth." Grania leaned into his shoulder, grateful for the solid warmth of him, and let herself feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. She had come to Millbrook 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate need to learn how to refuse. Now she had a business, a partner, a future that she had chosen for herself, and the certainty that she could protect it if she needed to. It was more than she had dared to hope for, and the joy of it was almost painful in its intensity. The first commission she took in the new workshop was a wedding dress for a merchant's daughter, an intricate piece that required hundreds of hours of detailed embroidery. She worked on it through the summer, losing herself in the meditative rhythm of needle and thread, and when she finally delivered the finished garment, the merchant's daughter wept at the beauty of it. Word spread, as word tends to do in small towns, and soon Grania had more work than she could easily handle, a waiting list of clients who were willing to pay premium prices for her skill. She hired an apprentice, a young human girl named Tam who had a good eye and patient hands, and taught her the basics of fine needlework. It felt strange at first, being the one in a position of authority, but Grania discovered that she could mentor without exploiting, could expect high standards without grinding someone down. She paid Tam a fair wage, gave her reasonable hours, and made sure she understood that no was an acceptable answer to any request. Tam thrived under that treatment, and watching her grow in confidence and skill, Grania felt a sense of completion, as though some circle had been closed. Autumn came around again, marking a full year since the day Fenwick had intervened with Corvin and changed the trajectory of her life. They celebrated by closing both the shop and the workshop for the afternoon, and walking out into the countryside beyond Millbrook, following a path that wound through fields gone gold with harvest. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in the easy companionship they had built, and when they reached a hill that overlooked the valley, they sat in the grass and watched the shadows lengthen. "I have another request," Fenwick said eventually. "You are full of them." "I am. It is one of my most charming qualities, or so I tell myself." He turned to face her fully, and there was something nervous in his expression, an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I would like to marry you. Not because I think we need a legal contract to validate what we have, and not because I am trying to lay claim to you or your work, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you officially and publicly. But I am also aware that marriage is a complicated institution with a lot of history around ownership and obligation, particularly for women. And I want you to know that if you say no, it will not change anything between us. We can continue exactly as we are, partners in all the ways that matter, and I will be perfectly content with that." Grania looked at him, at the man who had taught her how to refuse, and then celebrated every time she did, who had built her a workshop and respected her boundaries, and loved her with a steadiness that had never once wavered. She thought about marriage, about what it would mean and whether she wanted it, whether the legal and social recognition mattered to her or whether what they already had was sufficient. "Ask me properly," she said finally. Fennec blinked. "What?" "If you are going to propose marriage, do it properly. I want the full experience, not some hedged request that I can easily ignore." A slow smile spread across Fennec's face, bright and wondering. He shifted position, getting down on one knee in the grass with unself-conscious formality, and took her hand in both of his. "Grania Everwood," he said, his voice gone soft with emotion. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met. You are strong and kind and brave in ways that most people will never understand. You have taught me things about respect and partnership that I did not know I needed to learn. And you have made every day of the last year better simply by existing in my life. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone, and I would be honored beyond measure if you would agree to marry me. Will you?" Grania felt tears prick at her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came from being seen and valued and chosen by someone who knew exactly who she was and loved her for it. She thought about saying yes, about the weight and beauty of that simple word when it was freely given, when it meant, "I choose you," instead of "I have no choice." "Yes," she said clearly, letting the word ring out across the hilltop. "Yes, I will marry you." Fennec surged up and kissed her, laughing against her mouth, and they tumbled together into the grass, clumsy and joyful and utterly certain. When they finally pulled apart, both of them grass-stained and grinning, Fennec produced a ring from his pocket, a simple band of silver set with a small green stone. "I have been carrying this around for a month," he admitted, waiting for the right moment to ask. "I was starting to worry I would lose it and have to start over." "It is beautiful," Grania said, and meant it. She slid it onto her finger where it fit perfectly and felt the weight of it settle into place like an anchor, grounding her in the reality of what they had just promised each other. They were married in the early spring, a small ceremony attended by friends and neighbors, officiated by the town's magistrate in the open space behind Fennec's shop. Grania wore a dress she had made herself, simple and elegant, embroidered with a pattern of oak leaves along the hem and cuffs. Fennec wore his best jacket and could not stop smiling, and when the magistrate pronounced them legally bound, the small crowd cheered with genuine warmth. The celebration afterward was held in the workshop, which had the most space, and people came throughout the afternoon and evening to offer congratulations and share food and drink. Grania stood in the center of her own space, surrounded by the evidence of her work and the people who had come to support her, and felt a sense of belonging so profound it made her lightheaded. At one point Tam approached with a small package wrapped in cloth. "I made you something," she said shyly. "For the wedding. I hope it is all right." Grania unwrapped the cloth to find a delicate embroidered handkerchief, worked with a pattern of interlinked circles. The stitches were even and careful, the work of someone who had learned their lessons well, and Grania felt her eyes sting with fresh tears. "It is perfect," she said, pulling Tam into a hug. "Thank you." Later, when the celebration had wound down and most of the guests had gone home, Grania and Fennec stood together in the doorway of the workshop, looking out at the twilit garden. Fennec had his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling tired and happy and deeply at peace. "Do you regret it?" Fennec asked softly. "Any of it?" "No," Grania said, and the word was steady and sure, no hesitation, no doubt. "Not a single moment. Even the hard parts, even the fear, even the months of standing in front of a mirror trying to shape my mouth around a word that terrified me. All of it brought me here to this moment, and I would not trade it for anything." "Good," Fennec said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Because I have plans for our future, and most of them require you to be present and willing. I am not promising to agree to all your plans. I would be disappointed if you did. They moved into the house together after the wedding, and Grania discovered that living with Fennec was both easier and more complicated than she had anticipated. Easier because they already knew each other so well, had worked out most of their potential conflicts during the year of partnership before marriage. More complicated because sharing space required constant negotiation, constant communication about needs and boundaries, and the 1,000 tiny compromises that made cohabitation possible. But they were good at negotiation by now, had built a relationship founded on the ability to say what they wanted and hear what the other person needed. They had arguments, certainly, moments of friction when their desires conflicted, but they worked through them with patience and honesty, and the foundation of their partnership held firm. Summer arrived, hot and drowsy, and with it came news that sent a small shock through Millbrook's orc population. Mistress Urith had been arrested in a town 3 days' ride to the east, charged with fraud and attempted extortion after trying to pull the same scheme on another former employee. The case had gone to trial, witnesses had been called, and the documentation she had used had been proven false in a very public and humiliating fashion. She had been sentenced to repay her victims and serve time in prison, and her reputation was in ruins. Fennec brought Grania the news one afternoon, his expression carefully neutral as he explained what he had heard from a traveling merchant. "I thought you would want to know," he said, "in case it brings you any closure." Grania sat with the information for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. She had spent so many years afraid of that woman, so much energy trying to become someone who could stand up to her. And now Mistress Urith was in prison, brought down not by Grania's refusal but by her own greed, her inability to stop exploiting people even when it put her at risk. "I feel," Grania started, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I feel like I should be more triumphant about this. Like I should be celebrating her downfall, but mostly I just feel tired. She took so much from me, from all of us who worked for her, and no amount of prison time will give that back. I am glad she has been stopped, glad she cannot hurt anyone else, but I do not need her punishment to validate my own worth." "That," Fennec said quietly, "is the most mature response I have ever heard to someone getting their comeuppance, and I am in awe of your ability to rise above pettiness." "I would be throwing a party." "Oh, I am still angry," Grania clarified. "I will probably be angry for the rest of my life about what she did to me, but the anger does not control me anymore, and her fate does not define mine. I built something better than revenge. I built a life that has nothing to do with her at all." As summer deepened into autumn, Grania realized she was pregnant. The knowledge arrived not as a shock but as a quiet certainty, her body changing in subtle ways that she recognized before any other outward sign appeared. She told Fennec one evening over dinner, simply and directly, and watched his face cycle through surprise and joy and a brief flash of terror before settling back into joy. "A baby," he said, testing out the words. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Grania confirmed. "In the spring, if my calculations are correct. How do you feel about that?" Terrified, delighted, convinced I am going to be terrible at this and determined to try anyway. Fennec reached across the table to take her hand. "How do you feel about it? All of those things," Grania admitted. "And also curious. I have no idea what kind of parent I will be, but I know what kind of parent I do not want to be, and that seems like a reasonable place to start." They spent the winter preparing, transforming one of the spare rooms in the house into a nursery, acquiring the necessary supplies, reading every piece of advice they could find, and then deciding which parts they would actually follow. Grania continued to work through most of the pregnancy, taking commissions until her changing shape made the detailed needlework difficult, and then switching to simpler projects that did not require quite so much precision. The baby arrived on a rainy spring morning after a labor that was long and exhausting but ultimately uncomplicated. Grania held her son for the first time and looked into his tiny, scrunched face, and felt a love so fierce and protective it took her breath away. He had her green skin and pointed ears, Fennec's gray eyes and dark hair, and he yelled with impressive volume when the midwife checked him over. "He has excellent lungs," the midwife observed. "That is always a good sign." They named him Varan, and he became the new center of their universe, demanding and exhausting and more wonderful than either of them had anticipated. Fennec proved to be a devoted father, getting up for midnight feedings and changing diapers without complaint, and singing terrible off-key lullabies that somehow always worked. Grania navigated motherhood with the same determination she had brought to everything else, learning as she went, making mistakes and correcting them, refusing to let anyone tell her there was only one right way to raise a child. When Varan was 6 months old, Grania returned to the workshop part-time, bringing him with her in a basket where he could sleep or watch her work with wide, curious eyes. Tam had taken on more responsibility during Grania's absence, and the business had continued to thrive, proof that what they had built was solid enough to withstand change. One afternoon, as Grania was finishing up a particularly intricate piece of embroidery while Varan napped in his basket, she heard voices outside the workshop. She looked up to find a young orc woman standing in the doorway, hesitant and nervous, barely out of her teens if Grania was any judge. "Can I help you?" Grania asked gently. I heard you take apprentices," the girl said, her voice thin with uncertainty. "I am looking for work and I am good with my hands, and I thought, but if you are not hiring, I understand. I will not bother you." She was already starting to back away, and Grania recognized the instinct, the desire to flee before rejection could land. "Wait," she said, setting down her needle. "Come in. Tell me about yourself." The girl crept into the workshop like she expected to be thrown out at any moment, and Grania spent the next hour talking to her, learning her story. Her name was Sira. She had worked for a seamstress in a neighboring town until the business folded, and she was desperate for a position that would let her use her skills. She was also, Grania realized quickly, someone who had never learned to advocate for herself, who said yes to everything and apologized for existing. She saw herself in that girl, saw the person she had been a year and a half ago, and made a decision. "I will hire you on a trial basis," she said. 3 months, fair wages, and I will teach you everything I know about fine needlework. But I am also going to teach you something else, something that has nothing to do with thread and fabric. I am going to teach you how to say no." Sierra blinked at her, confused. "I do not understand." "You will," Grania promised. "Come back tomorrow morning and we will begin." She trained Sierra the same way Fennec had trained her, with patience and respect and an absolute insistence on honest communication. She asked Sierra to do things, and then asked her how she felt about doing them, pushed her to articulate her own needs and preferences, celebrated every small refusal as a victory. It was slower work than simply training her in needlework, but Grania found it deeply satisfying, the sense of passing on something valuable that went beyond technical skill. Tam watched these training sessions with knowing amusement. "You are going to build an army of women who cannot be pushed around," she observed one day. "Good," Grania said. "The world could use more of them." The years unfolded, one after another, marked by the steady accumulation of small joys and manageable challenges. The business grew. Grania's reputation spreading beyond Millbrook to neighboring towns and even cities. She took on more complex commissions, pieces for wealthy merchants and nobles, but she also made time for simpler work, mending and alterations for people who could not afford premium prices. Fenwick's shop continued to thrive, his gift for finding exactly what people needed serving him well, and together they built a comfortable life that owed nothing to anyone's debt or obligation. They had 2 more children, daughters named Clara and Mira, born 2 years apart. Clara had Fenwick's coloring and Grania's temperament, quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for observation that sometimes seemed uncanny. Mira was wild and joyful, all energy and enthusiasm, with her mother's green skin and her father's talent for charming everyone she met. Varon grew into a serious, gentle boy who loved books and had a particular fascination with maps, spending hours studying the geography of places he had never seen and probably never would. Grania taught all of them, as soon as they were old enough to understand, that they had the right to refuse. She taught them that no was a complete sentence, that they did not owe anyone their time or labor or affection simply because it was requested, that their boundaries deserved respect. And she taught them by example, living a life where she said no when she needed to and yes when she meant it, where her choices were her own and her worth was inherent rather than conditional. On a clear autumn morning, 10 years after the day she first practiced saying no in front of a mirror, Grania stood in the Millbrook Market Square and prepared to open a stall. Not in her workshop, which remained her primary workspace, but a dedicated market stall where she could sell finished pieces and take orders and show people the range of what she was capable of. It was a risk, putting herself out in public that way, but it was also a statement, a claim of space and value that felt important. Fenwick stood beside her, helping arrange the display, and Tam and Sierra were there too, having closed the workshop for the morning to support the opening. Varon, Clara, and Mira darted between the adults, excited by the novelty, and the market was already beginning to fill with people curious about the new stall. A man approached, middle-aged and well-dressed, examining the pieces on display with a critical eye. He picked up one of Grania's embroidered handkerchiefs, turned it over to study the stitching, and then named a price that was less than half what the piece was worth. "I will give you 3 crescents for this," he said, in the tone of someone doing her a favor. 10 years ago, Grania would have accepted without question, grateful for any price at all. 5 years ago, she might have negotiated, tried to explain the value of the work and hope he understood. But now, standing in her own market stall with her family around her and a decade of hard-won confidence behind her, she simply looked at him and smiled. "No," she said clearly. "That piece is priced at 8 crescents, which reflects the hours of work and skill required to create it. If that does not suit your budget, I wish you luck finding something more affordable elsewhere." The man blinked, surprised by her refusal, and then tried again. "Come now, surely you can be more flexible. 8 crescents is excessive for a bit of embroidery." "It is not excessive, it is fair, and the price is firm." Grania's voice was pleasant but immovable. "Thank you for your interest." The man stared at her for a moment longer, then huffed and walked away. Grania watched him go without any regret, and when she turned back, she found Fenwick watching her with an expression of such pride and love it made her heart skip. "That," he said softly, "never gets old." "What does not?" "Watching you stand your ground. Watching you know your worth and demand that others recognize it too." He leaned in to kiss her cheek. "I am so proud of who you have become." "I am proud of who I have become too," Grania said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The stall was a success. People came throughout the day, drawn by the quality of the work and Grania's growing reputation, and she made several substantial sales. She also turned down 3 more bad offers without a flicker of hesitation, and each refusal felt easier than the last, as natural as breathing. At one point, an older woman approached, orc-like Grania, with weathered skin and tired eyes. She examined the display for a long time before finally asking, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether Grania did custom work. "I do," Grania confirmed. "What were you thinking?" "A wedding dress," the woman said. "For my daughter. She is marrying a human man, and I want her to have something beautiful, something that shows she deserves celebration despite what some people think about mixed unions." Grania felt something twist in her chest, recognition and sympathy in equal measure. "I would be honored to make that dress. When is the wedding?" They discussed details, timing and style, and the budget the woman could afford, which was modest but manageable. When they had settled on terms, the woman reached out and gripped Grania's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said, "for being visible. For showing people like my daughter that we can build lives here, that we do not have to hide or apologize for existing. It matters more than you know." After she left, Grania stood quietly for a moment, processing the weight of that gratitude. She had not set out to be any kind of symbol, had simply been trying to build a life for herself, and had made that life as public and uncompromising as she knew how. But if that accidentally helped others find their own courage, she would not turn away from that responsibility. The afternoon wore on, and as the market began to wind down, a familiar figure made his way through the thinning crowd. Corvin, the thread seller who had tried to pressure her all those years ago, stopped at her stall with an expression that was hard to read. "Grania Everwood," he said, and there was something almost rueful in his voice. "Or Grania Zalter now, I suppose. I heard you had opened a stall, Corvin." Grania kept her voice neutral, curious about what he wanted but not particularly concerned. She was long past the point where he could intimidate her. "I wanted to," he stopped, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize. For that day, years back. I make my living by reading people and pressing advantages, but I have been thinking lately that there is a difference between good salesmanship and exploitation, and I crossed that line with you. I am sorry." Grania studied him, looking for any sign that this was another manipulation, but all she saw was genuine discomfort and what might have been actual remorse. "Why now?" she asked. "Why apologize after so long?" "Because my daughter is about your age, and recently she told me no about something I wanted her to do, and I realized I was doing to her what I had done to you. Pushing past her boundaries because I was convinced I knew better. She called me on it, and it made me think about all the times I have done that to other people, and I did not like what I saw." He spread his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I cannot undo any of it, but I wanted to at least acknowledge the harm and tell you I am trying to do better." "Thank you," Grania said after a moment. "I appreciate the apology, and I hope you do manage to change. Your daughter is lucky to have the courage to refuse you." Corvin nodded, looking relieved, and moved on. Fennec, who had been standing close enough to hear, raised his eyebrows at her. "That was generous of you," he observed. "It was honest," Grania corrected. "I am not interested in holding grudges against someone who is genuinely trying to improve, even if it took him far too long to get there. Life is too short to carry that much anger." As the sun began to set and they started packing up the stall, Grania took a moment to look around the market square, at the life she had built in this town, at the family gathered around her, and the work she had created. She thought about the woman who had stood in front of a mirror 10 years ago, struggling to voice the simplest refusal, and felt a wave of affection for that frightened girl. She had been so brave, even when she did not feel brave, and she had kept trying even when it seemed impossible. "Thank you," she whispered, too soft for anyone else to hear, speaking to that younger self across the years. "Thank you for not giving up." Fennec looked over at her, curious. "Did you say something?" "Just talking to myself," Grania said, smiling, reflecting on how far we have come. "We have come a considerable distance," Fennec agreed. He put his arm around her waist, pulling her close, and they stood together watching their children play in the fading light. "And we have a considerable distance yet to go, but I am glad to be traveling it with you. Even when I say no to your ridiculous schemes, especially then." They finished packing up as full dark arrived, and walked home together through the lamplit streets of Millbrook, a small procession of family and friends, carrying between them the evidence of a successful day and the promise of many more to come. Grania felt the weight of the ring on her finger, the hand of her son in hers, the solid presence of Fennec at her side, and knew with absolute certainty that she had built something real and permanent and entirely her own. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Grania stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom one last time. Not to practice refusal, she was long past needing that, but simply to acknowledge the woman looking back at her. The same green skin, the same small tusks, but the eyes were different now, full of confidence and earned pride. She had fought for this life, had paid for it in courage and determination and hundreds of small acts of boundary setting, and it was hers in a way that nothing had ever been hers before. "No," she said to her reflection, not because she needed the practice, but because the word had become a kind of talisman, a reminder of everything she had learned. "No, I will not accept less. No, I will not be diminished. No, I will not apologize for taking up space in the world." Behind her, reflected in the mirror, Fennec appeared in the doorway. He was smiling, that same warm, delighted smile he had worn the first time she refused him, and when she turned to face him, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you for exactly who you are, boundaries and refusals and all." "I love you too," Grania replied. "Thank you for teaching me that I was allowed to." "You taught yourself," Fennec corrected. "I just provided a safe space to practice." They stood together in the quiet room, holding each other in the lamplight, and Grania felt the last knot of old fear finally unwind and release. She was free. She had always been free in the deepest sense, but now she knew it, felt it in her bones, and that knowledge changed everything. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke and the promise of winter to come. But inside, in the house she had chosen, with the family she had built, Grania Everwood stood in front of her mirror and smiled at the woman reflected there, proud and unafraid and certain of her worth. She had learned to say no, and in learning that simple, terrible word, she had found her voice, her strength, and the beginning of a life that was entirely and completely her own. And that, she thought, as Fennec led her away from the mirror and toward the bed they shared, was worth every moment of fear it had taken to get here.